Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're tuning in today because, honestly, we're looking at something truly fascinating. If you love understanding how the human mind works, or you're just curious about how we can all learn a little better, you are in the exact right place. Today we're breaking down a highly innovative, 5-day educational framework called the Summit. It is essentially a masterclass in experiential learning and cognitive behavioral science. But here's the catch. It's completely disguised as a classroom game. So, it all starts with a seemingly impossible challenge. How in the world do you teach complex cognitive biases to 10-year-olds? I mean, think about it. You can't just stand at a whiteboard and lecture fifth graders about high-level concepts like scope insensitivity or reactive devaluation. No way. Their eyes would glaze over in about 5 seconds. You need a totally different approach to make these advanced psychological concepts actually stick without relying on boring textbook lectures. Well, the answer to that question is elegantly simple, and it's summed up perfectly by this quote right from the source material. You give them 5 towns, a $500 budget, and a storm that is 3 days away. Okay, let's dive into this. This is the brilliant premise of the Summit. It's a civic simulation that acts as a total Trojan horse. It sneaks high-level cognitive behavioral science into a high-stakes, incredibly engaging narrative that kids just get totally lost in. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll look at the 5th grade decision mission. Second, welcome to Greenfield Valley. Third, why boring choices win. Fourth, the day 3 trap. And finally, naming the thinking traps. All right, part 1, the 5th grade decision mission and the high stakes in Greenfield Valley. To really grasp how this framework operates, you have to picture the scenario. The students act as a regional youth council, right? And they're staring down a severe impending storm. But here's the constraint that drives absolutely all of the action. $500. That is their shared finite budget. They have to allocate this money to prepare the entire region for the storm, and once that cash is spent, it's gone for good. This creates an immediate, palpable tension in the room. Now, this isn't just free play. Strict mechanics make this simulation run like clockwork. The students are divided up into teams of 3 to 4, taking on very specific roles, like council president or budget manager. Every single day, representatives from 5 different towns request urgent funding. The council only gets 4 votes and 6 simulated hours per day to evaluate all these proposals. Oh, and they also have to maintain 100 community trust points, which fluctuate based on the quality of their governance. All of this plays out over 5 simulated days of just escalating pressure as that storm gets closer and closer. Moving on to Section 2, welcome to Greenfield Valley, focusing on flashy presentations versus real vulnerability. You know, what's really interesting about this setup is how perfectly it mirrors the way we adults get swayed by style over substance all the time. Take Market Square, for example. They have a population of 8,000, but a really low storm risk. But their presenter? It's Mr. Torres, an adult with a slick, professional slide deck who is confidently promising economic returns. Compare that to Pine Ridge, only 800 people, but their bridge is actively failing. If it falls, they are completely cut off from food and medicine. The risk is incredibly high, but their presenter is a nervous 5th grader named Ava with a hand-drawn map. The simulation is actively trying to trick the students into funding the confident adult with a big population number, entirely ignoring the critical life safety risk of the much smaller town. So to combat this, the simulation relies on a very specific rule, the equity checker. This is actually a mandatory student role on the council. Before any vote can happen, the equity checker has to read aloud how a proposal impacts all 5 towns. This introduces some absolutely vital friction. It forces the students to hit pause, look past that flashy presentation of Market Square, and really consider the vulnerable towns like Pine Ridge before they start spending their money. Which brings us to Section 3, why boring choices win and how the methodical consistently outperforms the dramatic. This brilliantly illustrates the core structural design principle of the entire simulation. It is constantly baiting these kids with a flashy trap. For instance, the Market Square Highway. It costs $100 and promises a $3 return on investment. Sounds amazing, right? But it only serves one single wealthy town. Contrast that with the boring winner. The Riverside Floodwall cost $150. It sounds incredibly unexciting, and the presenter just dryly reads Army Corps' data. But structurally, it is literally the best choice in the game because it single-handedly protects 3 entire towns downstream. The simulation is completely rigged so that boring, data-driven regional thinking always outperforms flashy, isolated choices. By forcing students to navigate these tricky choices, the framework secretly tests their cognitive skills using what's called the patience framework. But to keep it approachable, they use kid-friendly names, things like bounce-back thinking, plan B thinking, or brain check. It completely disguises the complex analytical tools the students are using to avoid these traps.
All right, Section 4, the Day 3 Trap, also famously known as the developer deal.
This part of the explainer plays out literally like a psychological thriller. Day 1 is all about hearing the first proposals. Day 2, the impact reports roll in showing if they made good choices, and suddenly the storm is upgraded to severe. Panic definitely starts to set in. Then comes Day 3. The storm is practically here. The budget is super tight. And out of nowhere, a private developer named Jordan Blake arrives offering a deal to fix Pine Ridge's bridge for free. But here is the catch. The clock is ticking. The teacher starts a visible 5-minute timer right there in the room. The kids have exactly 5 minutes to read this proposal and accept a free bridge repair. And the absolute genius part of this? The teachers are explicitly forbidden from pointing out the fine print on page 3 of the contract. They literally just step back and let the clock run. So what happens next is crucial. The vast majority of these kids see the word free, they panic about the ticking clock, and they just sign the deal. But if they had taken a breath and read the environmental impact section on page 3, they would have seen this. To fix the bridge, the developer gets to log the forest. This drastically increases Riverside's flood risk, it cuts off Farmdale's emergency timber, and it effectively gives away the region's public forest for 20 years. It's an absolute disaster. The rushed kids inevitably miss this, proving that making mistakes under pressure, that friction, is the true teacher here. Finally, Section 5, naming the thinking traps and the discovery first reveal. So Day 5 arrives. The storm hits, the consequences of all their rushed choices play out, and the true pedagogical genius is finally revealed during the class debrief. The simulation uses a strict discovery first rule. Basically, the teacher never uses academic terms until the kids have actually lived the mistake. Remember on Day 1 when they funded the town of 8,000 instead of the 800 people in Pine Ridge whose bridge was collapsing? The kids naturally call that the small number problem. Once they explain how their brains tricked them into thinking a bigger number meant a bigger emergency, only then does the teacher drop the research term scope insensitivity. Let's look at another translation. A lot of kids stubbornly stick to that terrible developer deal on Day 4, even after realizing the terrible flood risks, simply because they publicly promised to help Pine Ridge back on Day 3. The kids call it the promise trap. The teacher then explains that actually, researchers call this consistency bias, which is the intense pressure to stick to a bad plan just because you already committed to it out loud. Or how about this scenario from Day 2? If the kids felt tricked by that slick presenter, Mr. Torres, and his highway on Day 1, they will almost always reject his genuinely helpful medical supply proposal on Day 2. They reject a great idea just because they distrust the person bringing it to the table. The kids call it the other side is wrong. The official academic term, reactive devaluation. Then you have the good deed pass. Councils who actually funded the boring, helpful flood wall early on felt like they had been so incredibly responsible, they essentially earned the right to slack off and take the careless developer deal later. The formal scientific term for this phenomenon is moral licensing. And wrapping up our translations, we have the my stuff trap. When kids fund the highway on Day 1, they flat out refuse to take that money back on Day 4 to fix a real emergency. Why? Because the money feels like it already belongs to the highway project. It's their stuff now. In cognitive science, this is widely known as the endowment effect. By living through these biases firsthand, the students truly internalize them in a way a textbook could never achieve. The teacher guide has this beautiful summary. Once you know your brain can be tricked by a big number, a loud voice, or a shiny deal, you can start catching it. And really, the core takeaway of this entire explainer is that these 5th grade lessons, they aren't just for kids. They are the exact same tools we adults desperately need to navigate complex, real-world governance, contracts, and daily business decisions. So that leaves us with one final, pretty provocative thought to ponder as we wrap up today. When was the last time your brain was tricked by a big number or a loud voice? Honestly, did you fall for a flashy presentation instead of looking at the boring data? Did you sign a free deal without reading page 3? The summit reminds us all that our brains are totally wired for shortcuts, but with a little bit of friction and a little bit of patience, we can actually learn to decide better. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope you found it as fascinating as I did. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.